So what I'm going to do is we're going to start off with a brief presentation, about 15, 20 minutes to kind of lay a little bit of a foundation for what we're going to talk about. And then we're going to open it up to some questions. I think Brian's going to have some questions to kind of start us off with. And then if there's other questions, feel free to just put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll try to monitor both to answer questions. So to dive right in, I'm going to start off by sharing my screen with you. So here we go. And we start off a little bit of background is to tell you about this class that we put together a few years ago. It's been 4 years now, or the fourth offering is going to be this year, offered at Stanford, which is CS 182, and it's called Ethics, Public Policy, and Technological Change. And this is a class that is co-taught with Rob Reich, who's a political philosopher, and Jeremy Weinstein, who is a social scientist in the political science department. And the three of us came together about 4 years ago because what we saw was basically students getting a lot of power tools, so to speak, in computer science, which had become by far the largest major on campus at Stanford. But there was really a need to understand more the externalities that were involved in computing. And there were a lot of different issues that we got into, data privacy being one of the primary ones. But the important thing was to look at these issues, not just technologically, but to understand from a philosophical perspective, what were some of the value trade-offs that were involved when we think about particular kinds of technology. For example, if we consider encryption actually encodes with it certain values, and it puts a high value on something like privacy, but that value is actually being traded off in other cases where actually you may not want as much privacy if you want to, for example, have greater security, if you want to be able to scan messages for things like human trafficking or child pornography. To get greater security, you need to trade off some privacy. And so we can begin to talk about a philosophical framework for those kind of value trade-offs, what is and is not enabled by the technology, to see how that wraps into it, and then understand from a policy perspective, what are the kinds of things we might want to do collectively to get to outcomes that we think are beneficial on a societal level, not just necessarily an individual level. And so with that idea in mind for this class, what we ended up doing, I'm just going to advance the slides here, is there was also this experience that many of you who've been in Silicon Valley have probably seen. Is in the last 5 to 10 years, we've sort of moved from a world of tech optimism to a world of tech pessimism. And the course that we had was kind of situated in that to get people to understand that we're not living in a technological utopia, but it's not a dystopia either. Our technologies are basically things we can potentially control as long as we have some guardrails in place to get the outcomes that we care about. And so part of that was writing this book called System Error, Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot, with Rob Reich and Jeremy Weinstein, the co-authors for the class. My slides seem to be auto-advancing, which is a little bit odd. But this book just came out about a month ago, and it talks about some themes. And the reason why we actually wrote the book was we wanted to be able to point out some of the negative social consequences of technology. We wanted to think about what are the issues that arise when we have these technological issues, like your slides advancing on their own, but to really unpack their systematic drivers. These are things where technology is not neutral by itself. It is driven by a set of people. But as we talked about, that technology encodes particular values. And once we begin to understand those value trade-offs, we can come up with more pragmatic ideas as to how we can harness the benefits while mitigating some of the harms. And so in that notion, there's 3 main ideas we kind of talk about as the drivers for this particular technological shift that we've seen. One of them is what we refer to as the optimization mindset. And the idea behind the optimization mindset is that's what computer scientists are often taught to do, right? We look at algorithms based on how efficient they are, how much we can optimize things, say, when we do something like machine learning. But that mindset values, again, puts particular emphasis on particular values. So when we think about, for example, optimizing an algorithm for accuracy, accuracy is dominated by the majority in the data. So if we have data, for example, that represents lots of groups, and some of those groups are very underrepresented in the data, you can still do very well on accuracy while doing terribly on those groups. And so we need to keep that in mind when we think about what is the thing that we're actually optimizing and what does that mean with respect to the externalities it might generate. That also leads into a notion of an obsession with scale. One of the things that we've seen with computing in recent years is this desire for everything to scale to millions or billions of people. But when we think about the scaling phenomena, what oftentimes happens is the thing that we're trying to optimize, which is some proxy for what we care about in the real world, as we do it at scale, that proxy diverges more and more from what's going on in the real world. Simple example, Facebook. They want to create connection in the world because they think that connection will make people happier. They connect to more people. But what are they actually optimizing when they're trying to create that connection? They're optimizing for things like time spent on platform, number of click-throughs on things. When those are the things you're optimizing for, what you have a tendency to do is put content in front of people that is more inflammatory or titillating because that's what they're more likely to engage with. So we might have this notion of connecting people, but in fact, by optimizing a particular metric at scale, what we're really doing is creating more outrage or putting people into filter bubbles, and we see the externalities of that. And the last one is the deliberate indifference of politicians. Basically, back in 1995, 1996, in order to foster the growth of the internet, there was a deliberate regulatory oasis built around high-tech companies, partly through the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, which is now being sort of debated a lot in the news and in Washington, D.C. But it was actually a deliberate point of politicians to basically say, hands off the internet, let it blossom. Well, it blossomed, and 25 years later, we're now still living in a world that has pretty much no regulation with respect to the internet, even though we see these negative externalities. And so that drives issues to think about what we want to do from a policy perspective. So in terms of the book, there's a few places we drill down in terms of the technologies and what they enable. One of them is around issues of algorithmic decision-making and notions of bias that can creep up in those algorithms and what that means with respect to fairness. What does it mean to be fair? And so we go into various kinds of detail in the book on that. With respect to sort of this festival going on now, one of the big issues we talk about data privacy and the notion of data maximization that often exists in companies, which is to gather as much data as you can, and at some point you're going to figure out what to do with it. What does that actually mean for our privacy? Well, it means a lot, as you've probably been seeing throughout this whole festival. I'll just give you a deep dive on one, on this issue, because that's what seems to be most germane for what we're talking about today. And in terms about thinking about the perspectives on privacy, we need to understand that privacy is really about balancing competing interests. It is not an absolute in itself. And to balance those competing interests, we need to understand what they are, right? So oftentimes you want to make data available. Yeah, my slides keep advancing. You want to make data available for meaningful analysis because sometimes there's public goods we care about, like being able to audit an algorithm or an algorithmic decision-making process to determine if it's fair. To do that, you need access to real data to determine how it's fair or unfair for different groups of people. Or in medical research to improve health outcomes, if we want to do data mining or machine learning on health records, we need access to those health records. And this kind of comes up over and over in the public good space. It's also been used to extreme effect for private goods, such as personalized advertising on the internet. But when we think about protecting individual privacy, the real notion of privacy stems, philosophically from the notion of respect for the individual. And one way to think about it is if you didn't have privacy, you might make different decisions about yourself and for others than if there were certain information you could actually keep private. And so to that extent, the value of privacy stems from your own personal autonomy. In the sense that the decisions that you make, if that process is different as a result of having or not having privacy, then the value of privacy is about you as a person living your life the way you want, not just an intrinsic value in privacy itself. There's, of course, notions of freedom of speech and freedom of activity. You want to be able to do certain things without having it be monitored and potentially to avoid discrimination. For example, in medicine, there are certain things about your health record which are not released because you don't want to be discriminated against based on certain things in your health history or other history that you may have. And so we actually have a fair bit of regulation in this space that, is important enough that it's not just 3-letter acronyms, it's things like 5-letter acronyms or 4-letter acronyms, some of which you're probably intimately familiar with, right? So FERPA protects your educational records, HIPAA protects your medical records, GDPR, which is in the European Union now, we have a version of it, the California Consumer Privacy Act in California, not yet federal, that tries to give you some more control over your data rights, and that's being litigated, and really to prevent access of your data from adversaries. So what does this all mean in kind of the broad sense? Well, let's delve into one particular technology that people often try to use with data when they want to make it available, say, for a beneficial access, but they're worried about preserving privacy in that data. And probably the most common form is anonymization. So one of the things that happens in anonymization, here is just a record I may have pulled out that has, I'm not going to put my real social security number on a slide, has things like, name, employer, title, date of birth, zip code, things like that. And I put myself in here and just one other made up record. And maybe this is for a health record. So there's some additional column that indicates if I have some medical condition or not, let's say, and that's true for everyone in the database. So I might look at this and say, I want to anonymize it. So one simple way to anonymize it is to drop personally identifying features like name and social security number. But not only do I want to drop that, I might say there are certain protected attributes like date of birth and gender. So let me drop those from the data as well. And now I can ask, how well does this actually work? So I'm going to take exactly that information you saw on the previous slide and just that was left over in the data record and put it in as a query on Google. And you can see I can de-anonymize the data basically straight away. So the basic naive notions of how we anonymize data by dropping individual identifiers, even if we try to drop some additional general information like your gender and your date of birth or your year of birth, may not be enough to sufficiently anonymize data. And there's lots of cases of data that's sort of put out for public use or for research use with the attempt to make it anonymized. And in fact, it's not anonymized at all. And I'll give you a real world example that's much more significant than just, looking me up on the internet. And that was in Massachusetts a few years ago. The Massachusetts Group Insurance Commission released an anonymized data set, quote unquote anonymized, of about 135,000 health records. And the governor at the time, William Weld in Massachusetts, assured the public that patient privacy would be protected because identifiers were deleted. Well, enterprising graduate student Lentonia Sweeney, who is now a professor at Harvard, but at the time was a graduate student in MIT, she knew that Weld lived in Cambridge. And for $20, I don't know why this keeps advancing, but for $20, she bought the voter roll of Cambridge voters. That included zip codes, birthdays, and genders of the 50,000 voters in the city. This is really getting annoying. She de-anonymized that data by just doing a database join, basically, to re-identify Weld, because there was only 6 people in Cambridge that shared Weld's birthday. Only 3 of those 6 were men, and only Weld lived in his zip code. So she was able to identify him uniquely. And then to make the point, she took his health records and mailed them to his office just to show him that the data was not anonymized. But this is just one example of how data that is put out with a good conscience for public usage can easily be de-anonymized, especially when it's joined with other data. And to prove her point, Sweeney went on to show that actually there's a lot less privacy than you think. 87% of all Americans can be uniquely identified by their zip code, birthday, and sex. And that kind of makes sense if you think about it, because there's 42,000 zip codes, 365 birthdays, and about an 80-year lifespan on average. So you just multiply those things together, and generally one of 2 sexes, although we know that there's more identifications. I'm just going to simplify for the sake of making the math easy and use 2. And you get 2.5 billion combinations. There's only about 330 million people in the United States. So you can imagine in that big grid, most of the cells only contain 1 person. And as a matter of fact, there's a website you can go to check this out called aboutmyinfo.org/identity. You can go there now and plug in things like your birthday, your gender, and your zip code and see if you're uniquely identified or how many people are in the cell with you in the database. There's a couple other things we talk about in the book. One of them is AI and automation and human well-being, and how many jobs are potentially going to be displaced by AI in the next 10 years, and the way we need to think about preparing for that so we just don't get a huge increase in unemployment. Also notions of free speech and democracy, the notions for example, that we see online these days with misinformation and disinformation being spread through social networks, but at the same time, the competing value of who has access to free speech and what is free speech, and how does that help ensure a thriving democracy, while at the same time we have people trying to inject misinformation into those same social networks. And really the bottom line of all this is that it doesn't have to be this way. So technology is not something that just happens to us that we have to accept as a wave that washes over us. It is actually in our control. Many of the people at this festival have a lot more agency than they think they do, because they're actually the ones building parts of this technology. But there's lots of different ways to get involved. One of them is, as we're actually seeing right now, a regulatory window is opening up in Washington, D.C., and regulators, lawmakers are trying to come up with policies around these things. The problem, and I can't stress this enough, is many of those lawmakers don't have technical background or don't have technical expertise in their office. So oftentimes what they rely on is basically information from lobbyists, from tech companies, to tell them about what legislation they should write. If that troubles you, that indicates what the problem here is. And really, it behooves technologists to get more involved in the process of being able to inform policymakers and regulators about technology, so we actually get policies that make sense both technologically and with respect to achieving the social outcomes we want to actually see. So what are the solutions? Well, the way it's oftentimes framed by tech companies is, well, you can either use an app or not use an app, right? So if Facebook is out there and you don't like their privacy policy, you can either delete it or you can use it. And you can take it one step further and say, well, we can set the privacy settings in our apps. We could set the privacy settings in our browser. We could use things like incognito mode. We can set cookie preferences now, thanks to GDPR and other regulations. So there's some things you can do at a personal level. But really, to be honest, that's extremely unsatisfying and something that's a huge systematic problem. And that's the way we kind of think about it in the book, is that this is not just a matter of individual choice, it's a matter of a broader system. And the analogy we draw to thinking about those systematic solutions is the roadways. So you can imagine 100 odd years ago at this point, more than 100 years ago, we had the advent of cars. And if we just told people, you know what, your choice is you can either drive or you cannot drive. If you decide to drive, be safe because it's dangerous. Or if you think it's too dangerous, just don't drive. And what would happen if we had no kind of system around roadways? We get a lot of people dying, which is actually what happened with the advent of cars when we didn't have more safety in our road systems and regulation. So what did we do? We had things like roads, we had lanes, we had stoplights, stop signs, speed bumps, a whole system that was created to create safety systematically around driving. And within that system, you still had a choice to drive, and you could drive safely or not drive. So it's not taking away personal choice, but it's creating a set of guardrails in some sense that make the system safer for everyone. That's what things like sensible privacy legislation can do. That's also what things like when there's discussion about algorithmic amplification in information ecosystems. Those are solutions we can also consider, but they need to be informed by people who have technical expertise in these areas. Otherwise, we're going to get bad legislation. And there's, if there's interest, if there's questions around that, I'm happy to take them, because there have been examples of bad legislation as well. But at this point, I'll stop the screen share and we can kind of go to a discussion to think about issues more broadly.
Hey, Mehran, this is Brian Jin, and I apologize for the technical issues at the start of the session. I had a nice introduction planned for you all to introduce your book, but thank you for jumping in and covering. For those in the audience, I'm Brian Jin. I'm the director of the University Privacy Office. I was going to moderate here. But thank you, Mehran, for that just really interesting and insightful talk. I think it does make sense for us to just kind of jump in for some audience questions. But let me ask a selfish one at first, just to kick us off. I mean, in the book, I know that you talk about automated decision making a lot, and I want to kind of dive into that a little bit more. That and the concept of bias, right, and some of the problems that come up when we rely on machines, right, to tell us what to do. And obviously, machines can process information a lot more efficiently than humans. But in your view, what are some of the problems that come up when we think about automated decision making?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ryan. I think, one of the biggest ones is people often think of automated decision making as a way to have more objective decision making, right? Because now it's being made by a computer. And this was something that happened in full force in California a couple of years ago. We had a Senate Bill 10, which was actually wanted to replace the cash bail system in California with a set of algorithms. Every county would choose their own algorithm. And what the algorithm would do is take a bunch of inputs from the defendant in the criminal justice system and then make a recommendation to a judge as to whether or not this person was high risk or low risk for recidivism, which is committing another crime in the future. And the judge would take that into consideration when deciding to grant bail or not. And it seemed like a great idea at the time, right? Because cash bail is actually a discriminatory system based on who has money and who doesn't. The problem is when people actually looked at some of these algorithms, so there was a famous example called the Compass algorithm made by a company called Northpoint. They've since changed their name. But ProPublica, which is a journalistic organization, looked at it. And what they found was that the recommendations the algorithm was making, if you were a Black defendant versus a white defendant, were quite different. If you were a Black defendant and you would not recidivate in the future, right? So they actually looked at some historical data to be able to look at this. The algorithm labeled you high risk 45% of the time. For white defendants who were in the same situations, white defendants who would not recidivate, they were labeled as high risk 23% of the time. So it was nearly double the rate of being labeled high risk, even if you wouldn't commit another crime, for Black defendants than white defendants. So clearly there was this difference in what we refer to as statistical parity with respect to the false positive rate. That's the specific notion of fairness that was being measured in that case. When this was brought to Northpoint's attention, they said, no, we're actually fair. We calibrated our algorithm by looking at all the scores that it would give. And for each score that it would give, we measured the likelihood of someone recidivating, what their percentage was. And we found that within one standard deviation, white defendants and Black defendants were within that one standard deviation across the whole range of risk scores. So it must be a fair algorithm, right? And it turns out part of the problem is these are two distinct notions of fairness that are actually mathematically incompatible with each other. When you try to raise one, the other one you can actually prove under general conditions gets a little bit lower. And so the question is, then it's not a technology question, right? Because you can optimize whatever you want. It becomes a philosophical question as to what is fair. And that's where we grapple with some of these issues, is to understand before we just go and implement something or think about a particular way of measuring it, we need to understand what is the thing we actually care about and what its societal outcome is. And the epilogue for that story is actually voters in California ended up repealing SB 10 through Proposition 25 in this last election cycle, because they didn't believe that algorithmic decision making would actually be more fair than the current system we have now, because of biases as a result of data that was these algorithms were trained on that actually had bias from historical human decision making.
Well, I love the way that you talk about the different disciplines coming together in your book. I mean, to me, one of the reasons it's so compelling is it's coming from you from a background in machine learning and AI and the technology side, as well as from Rob Reich, right, on the philosophy policy side, as well as Jeremy Weinstein from the kind of the political science perspective. And it really requires everyone from these different disciplines to kind of come in with these systemic solutions like you're talking about. Another thing that you mentioned in the book is kind of near the end, I want to give anything away, but you talk a little bit about the rise of China and digital authoritarianism. You talk about America's innovation and Europe's focus on regulation. And you mentioned bad legislation earlier, and maybe kind of coming back to that topic, you used the line, and I wrote this line down because I love it. You said, the choice between innovation and regulation is a false dichotomy. Can you comment a little bit more on that? I mean, do we have to make this choice between kind of letting companies just freely do whatever they want in the name of innovation, or can we smartly regulate them? I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for reading the book. That's a level of detail I really appreciate. But I do think it's a false dichotomy. I mean, usually there's this narrative you hear, which is that Europe regulates, the United States innovates. And it belies a sense of history. Like if you think about the history of the internet, and you think about what regulation actually is, all regulation really is a loaded term for government getting involved in some process. to be able to either foster that process or to put safeguards around that process. So if you look at the history of the internet, right, it's almost entirely government funded. And so it's a way for government to have created a different communication channel. And what they wanted to do was there were used to be lots of restrictions around, commercial activity on the internet. Most of those got lifted in the mid 1990s. At the same time, this regulatory oasis that I talked about before was being created because the government wanted to see the internet blossom, right? They actually, in some sense, the regulations they wrote were giving more freedom to what was going on the internet. It wasn't that they chose not to. It wasn't that they had ignorance around it. They made a deliberate choice to regulate in this particular way, which was very limited. But what we've seen over time is that there's other places where regulation actually makes sense. I mean, if just to look at historical examples, why most of the time when you eat food do you not get sick? Because we have all kinds of regulation around food safety, right? And so it's not that we don't get new innovation in food as a result. It's that we just have a system that makes it safer for everyone. Same sort of thing is going on now in technology. I think, one of the things that companies, the stance that they're taking to sort of remain unfettered is, well, if you try to regulate us, it's just going to kill any kind of innovation. There's not really any historical track record of that happening. And sometimes people say, well, you're going to entrench the larger players, because if you put in something like, privacy regulations, only the big players will have the resources to be able to react to that. You won't get startup activity because they can't comply with the regulation. And again, that's a misnomer, because it's just about writing the regulation in a smart way. And if you look at the California Consumer Privacy Act, they exactly did that. They actually have carve-outs for startup companies that say, until you reach a certain size, where that's defined by number of customers or revenue, a couple other metrics, you don't have to comply with the regulation. And the reason for that is twofold. One, it basically says, we're going to give you the freedom to be able to innovate as a small company. But what we're actually giving you is a roadmap that says, if you get large enough, right, to the extent where the impacts of what you build are now going to affect more people, you can already see what regulation is going to be down the road. So when you build your systems, you can actually build your systems with an awareness of what's going on while having the freedom to innovate early on. But where you're going to have these externalities in the system, then we need to have the guardrails in place. And that's a perfect example of ways that you can still foster innovation, but at some point down the line, you want to guarantee certain kinds of, individual rights or societal rights. So you just build that into the regulation. By itself, regulation doesn't have to be a bad word.
That's great. Thank you. I do want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. I have a number of more, but I'm not sure if we need to unmute folks from the side. I know that we have some folks back behind the scene.
And there's a couple questions in the chat too.
In chat. Okay. Well, let me ask you one more, and then I'm going to turn over to chat and read some other. But here's one question that I had for you. I wanted to ask you about just the role of technology as a solution to a lot of these problems, right? And some people might argue, right, technology itself is maybe the panacea for all the problems that technology has caused, right? Some people may say, can't you just kind of simplistically encrypt everything, right? Wouldn't that solve all of our problems? And, is that a false argument? And kind of how would you respond to that kind of argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're hitting a really important point there, which is that when we think about any particular technology, it's what value is the value that is preferred by that technology. And so when we think about data privacy, we can look at a couple examples. Encryption is a great one, right? So we can say, let's just encrypt all communication. That will guarantee us personal privacy in our communications. We don't need to worry about what, big tech or big brother or whatever is doing in terms of looking over our shoulder. And, it's an interesting idea, but the flip side becomes, well, are there benefits you would actually get from sharing data in particular cases? For me personally, I would actually be happy if there's some reasonable way of anonymizing my data. And again, as we talked about in that example, you need to be careful when you do this, but to have my health records go into a system that actually helps determine what are the treatments that lead to better outcomes in terms of health outcomes for people. because I think at both an individual and a societal level, that is a real benefit I would like to see. And I think it's a tangible benefit when I talk to my friends who work in, medical data mining that can come out of this domain. And they say the biggest problem they have now is not coming up with more clever algorithms. The biggest problem they have is access to data. And so I'm sympathetic to that point of view. If you encrypt everything, if we encrypt everyone's medical records, we don't make them available for that kind of analysis. But the flip side there is that, what about other technologies? What about differential privacy? Like, that's a great one that's been proposed for saying you can make statistical queries of data, get data to do data mining on, but you're still maintaining some level of privacy. And that's true. But what we've sort of seen is the trade-off then is what's actually encoded into differential privacy is this notion of protecting data rights for the majority. And as this is actually playing out in the census, right, in the 2020 census, where they say, well, we're going to give access to that data to researchers using differential privacy. The problem that comes up is the way differential privacy works, just for people who may not be familiar with it, is you basically inject a little bit of randomness into the data. So you can't individually identify any particular record. Well, the problem with that is when you have some subgroup of the population that's sufficiently small, that subgroup appears as noise, or they get washed out when you add the noise. And so again, you need to understand, differential privacy is a great technology for a lot of things, but it does have this value trade-off where it tends to favor the majority. And so we need to be aware of that when we do analysis and, how we set up systems to do that. So, I think our point in the book is not that there's a uniquely correct or incorrect answer, but that there's value trade-offs in all of these situations. And if we can understand what those value trade-offs are, we can make better technology decisions when we choose to pursue a particular solution.
That's great. Thank you. Well, let's, for some reason, I cannot see the chat on my side. And maybe because I'm a participant and not a moderator, but are you able to see?
Yeah, I can see it. So if you want, I can just pull out some questions from the chat, if that's all right.
Sure, sure.
So Anna asks, what kind of people would have the appropriate expertise to advise lawmakers? And can you please provide an example of poor legislation? Thanks for asking. I think, some of the expertise that's really needed right now on Capitol Hill is an understanding of data privacy and these notions of what are technologies that can be brought to bear and what kinds of things can they guarantee and not guarantee. So one of the big debates that goes on in Washington right now, and Jeremy Weinstein, who's one of the co-authors of the book, actually saw this play out in the Obama administration, is whether or not government can have some sort of backdoor into encrypted systems. That creates all kinds of issues with who has access, how do they have access. The way this came up was the most public-facing case of it was there was a shooter in San Bernardino, California, he had an iPhone, and the FBI wanted to unlock his iPhone to determine whether or not he may have been part of a terrorist cell to see if there was other activity that was going on or if he was basically sort of a lone shooter. And so the FBI wanted Apple to unlock the iPhone. Apple said no. Eventually, the way it played out was that they actually got a private firm to crack the iPhone and got the data off it. But it raises this question if there's actually a tension there between national security and privacy. So the kind of expertise we need are people who really understand, are there ways to find technological solutions to those kinds of things? More recently, that's played out with again, with Apple, because they have privacy by design, the whole notion of whether or not you would hash files that people put up on iCloud to determine if there was human trafficking, right, or child pornography. And that created a huge uproar. Why? Because it broke the perception of Apple as providing this, high level of privacy. And really what there was a value trade-off. Other people were saying, no, actually human trafficking is pretty bad. If we can come up to some solution to help mitigate that problem while maintaining, a lot of privacy, maybe not in an absolute sense, that's actually a good trade-off to make. And so people who can help bring that kind of technical expertise into Washington would be fantastic, or into local government. I'll give you an example, which is actually from the standpoint of local government, because that's another way people can get involved. in New York City a few years back, James Vaca was a council person there, and he had a bunch of constituents who were asking him questions about how algorithmic decision making was responsible for things like which kids got assigned to which schools and which police units were going to police which particular areas. And he didn't have an answer, and he wanted to find out, how is this stuff being done? What are the algorithms that are involved? And it was difficult for him to get answers as a council member. So he introduced a piece of legislation that said we need to have algorithmic transparency. And the way we're going to have algorithmic transparency is algorithms that make these kinds of decisions, the algorithm will be published so it can be scrutinized. And you're like, okay, for someone who doesn't know what they're doing, that seems like a good idea. And for anyone who understands how machine learning works, they say, well, publishing the algorithm for like a neural net isn't going to tell you how this thing's making decisions, because one, you don't have the data, and two, you don't have the parameters. So you could say, okay, well, now we're going to release the data along with it. Well, if you do that, you've just violated a bunch of people's, of whoever's data was actually used to train that system. And if you release the parameters, who's going to be able to look at a neural net that's got, a few million parameters and understand how it's making its decisions? So it was a well-intentioned piece of legislation. It just didn't understand how the technology would work, and ultimately it failed. It got voted down. But people, for example, who have understanding of algorithmic decision making and machine learning processes can get involved to say, maybe the way we want to understand a piece of legislation is by auditing an algorithm and publishing the results, not necessarily by publishing the code of the algorithm itself. And so those are places you can get involved.
Just quickly building on that, I mean, I've heard the concept of explainability, which is even the people that build the algorithms may not be able to fully themselves understand how the conclusions are drawn. I mean, is that the case? Do you have thoughts on that and how that kind of plays out from a privacy and ethical perspective?
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's actually an area of active research, which is, from a philosophical standpoint, there's this question of, do you have a right to an explanation? From the public policy standpoint, there's this thing called due process that says you should be able to challenge the results of an algorithm, understand why it made its decision, and then potentially have that decision overwritten, which is an interesting thing for an algorithm, because if you ask an algorithm to revisit a decision, it's going to make the same decision. But then getting to that from the perspective of technology, that notion of algorithmic transparency really raises the questions of, what do we need to know with respect to what the algorithm is doing? And there's a lot of people who build complicated neural networks who can't really tell you what it's doing, but there's at least ways where you can try to measure, like, as I vary different inputs, how does that affect the output? There's been some work actually at Stanford recently by but we did it before he came to Stanford. He just joined the faculty here, Carlos Gestrin, who has a system where you can look at sort of a simplified version of, if you take an algorithm and treat it as a black box, if we were to look at the decision for a particular instance and kind of create a simplified version of the algorithm at that instance, can you measure which factors more or less are impacting the decision, and be able to understand that maybe it was really these particular features that had the greatest impact on the decision that was made for an individual. And at the end of the day, I think it's always possible to do audits, right? Which is, you just take a set of data, you run it through the algorithm, and you measure the results on a bunch of things like, did it have gender bias? Did it have racial bias? And you can measure those kinds of things and see, not that algorithms are going to be entirely unbiased, but how much bias is there that's going to get amplified at scale if we try to put this thing out there? And then what can we do to try to mitigate it? So it's an excellent area. And I think something that's going to need a lot more attention as algorithms kind of make even more significant decisions in our lives. To pull another question out of the chat, Nick says, I struggle with how we get lawmakers to take privacy regulations seriously. Facebook and Amazon are now the biggest spenders on lobbyists, true. And the average consumer doesn't seem to be attuned to these issues. Any advice? It's a good point. A lot of consumers are not. There's a thing called the privacy paradox, which I'm sure you're familiar with, right? But it's the notion of, when you ask people how much they care about privacy, a large majority of people say they do. It's something that's important to them. And then you ask people, have you taken any steps to protect your privacy, right? Have you changed the privacy settings in your browser? Or have you changed some app? And almost everyone says no. And so it's, what is really the value of privacy? So I hear you, Nick. That it hits close to home. But I think what needs to happen is not that everyone needs to be attuned to it, but I think the value of privacy is something that regulators are beginning to see more, whether or not they see it because they personally believe it or they just believe it's something to win points in an election. At some point really doesn't matter. What matters is that they have the expertise to be able to make those kinds of decisions. And that's the place, kind of the call to get more involved as a technologist if you do. I think there are more people who are going off to work for agencies in Washington, and also times when, for example, staffers come out to places like Stanford to learn more about these things. So, the advice I would give you is try to get involved in the ways that you can. Talk to local politicians, go talk to whoever your congressperson is when they have a town hall, and raise these issues as things you care about. And then give them feedback about the things that actually matter and see if you can engage them in a more meaningful conversation. Because in many cases, lawmakers are, despite sometimes what's written in the news about they don't understand or they don't care, they do care. Whether or not they understand is questionable, but if someone is willing to provide expertise, they at least are willing to listen. And one more question. Doris asks, with different countries coming up with their data privacy regulation to safeguard their data, including the people regulation, PIPL from China recently, how do you see the trend, pros and cons on data localization? Great question. One of the things that's actually intriguing to me is that the people policy in China has a lot of, at least at some level, similarities to GDPR in Europe, which also has a fair bit of similarities to California Consumer Privacy Act in California. And so the interesting thing is that in many of these pieces of legislation, they have similar guidelines with respect to what kind of data should be protected, and more, or I should probably say less than more, what individual controls consumers should have over their data, or data subjects as they're referred to in GDPR, the subject on which data is being gathered. What I find fascinating is that these pieces of legislation have so many similarities, and they come from entirely different motivations, right? So like the motivation in Europe with respect to GDPR, which predates any of this other work by a couple of years, was about individual rights, right? And so Europe has a very strong framework around human rights and individual rights, and that's where GDPR really drew its foundation from. CCPA in California came as a reaction, not based on just fundamental rights, but it started as a backyard conversation between someone who was actually an engineer at Google and a businessman who was wondering how much information was actually being gathered. And with this engineer told him, like, it's a lot more than you think, and we can do more with it than you're probably aware of. And that just freaked him out. And so he actually basically bankrolled this legislation, went through a bunch of iterations. There's kind of a whole separate story there, but got to a place that actually mirrored GDPR in a bunch of ways based on an entirely different motivation. And the motivation in China is also completely different, right? The motivation in China comes from curbing the control of the technology sector in China, the private sector, both domestically and internationally, as a way of maintaining greater government control, because they were seeing that companies were gathering a lot of data. They were having large market capitalizations. Some of their chief executives were becoming a little bit more outspoken in their criticism of the government. So this was a way to send a very clear message as to who's in charge. Entirely different motivation, but a lot of the guidelines are the same, which leads me to believe if we can get to, looking at a world stage that leads to this kind of thing, maybe Democrats and Republicans aren't really that far apart in terms of being able to come up with some sensible data privacy regulation at a federal level that they can agree to. And guess what? It'll probably look a lot like CCPA and GDPR. Annie, I think that might be what we have in the chat so far. Any other questions or thoughts?
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I was in a discussion right before this session talking about the role of government and tech companies and individuals and kind of the different challenges that they face. And I think, a lot of people often just feel kind of on an individual basis a little bit helpless and powerless, meaning we're kind of this tiny bit in the system, and you talk about kind of larger responses look at how you talk about reasserting control over our data. And you've kind of touched on how we do that, but that might be just kind of a last way to, you have thoughts on how do we as individuals, right, move forward, and how do we engage in the dialogue? I sometimes think about that from our privacy office perspective, right? We're in many ways in higher ed to help raise the dialogue on some of these issues. So how do we get people engaged? How do we get individuals excited about these issues and really helping us move forward?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, Brian, the work that your office is doing is really important. It's important to get people to understand how, first of all, the value of privacy, and then what that means in kind of the ecosystem they live in. What data is being gathered about them, in which context, and how is it being used? And having some notion of understanding what the safeguards are around that data. One of the things that's kind of interesting there, I'm sure you're well aware, is there's a lot more regulation around public data. And what I mean by public data is data, for example, that the government might gather, than private data, which is data that, the Facebooks and Googles of the world gather. And I say that as someone who spent, more than half a decade working at Google, right? So it's like I was, involved in how the sausage was made. So I'm not saying this as, sitting in an ivory tower or something like that. It's you see these stark differences. The first level is really understanding, what is the data that's being gathered and what can be done with that data. And there's a lot of, I don't want to be sensationalist, right? I always like to take kind of this mid ground, but it's pretty shocking sometimes when you look at some of the studies, for example, on Facebook, as to what can be inferred from someone's personality or their personal profiles or their sexual orientation or a bunch of other things, just based on like the kinds of things they click on that they like. There was actually a study a few years ago, I think it was Kaczynski was the lead author, that looked at that, where they looked at a bunch of things like, could you predict whether or not someone's parents were divorced before they were 25 years old, that being the person themselves, based on what they liked on Facebook? And the answer was, yeah, you could actually do it with like reasonable probability, right? That's kind of frightening that you can make those kind of inferences about someone's personal life. So at a personal level, there are these levers that the companies give you, right? What sorts of things the freedom to engage with a particular platform or not, what kind of privacy settings you want to set. But I do think it's pretty deeply unsatisfying. One, because a lot of the privacy settings are not even well known, or how you set them or what their implications are. We asked this question in class about if you want to post something on Facebook and it tags some people, so it shows up in their feed, but then they have friends who are not your friends. Can they see the post that you make in the feed where you tag a friend, but they're not your friend? And so you ask this question, which happens a lot, right? It sounds like a convoluted setup, but that's like a lot of posts in the world, what they do. Like 5 people out of 300 knew the answer to that question, right? And these are people who are pretty savvy on social media, right? They're Stanford students in a computer science class. But it's understanding, once there's kind of that wake-up call of what can be done with that data, then it is the call to action. Maybe I should do something at a personal level. Maybe I should set those personal settings. But like some of the folks asked in the chat, which I really appreciate, to take it one level further and say, how can I get involved in the broader process of creating the societal guardrails for everyone? Because, we're pretty privileged here. We got a lot of understanding of technology. We got a lot of understanding of privacy and algorithms and a bunch of other things. The vast majority of the world doesn't. And so in some sense, that gives us a greater responsibility to say, how do we make the system better for everyone by getting involved?
I agree, and that's a great way of putting it. And thank you so much. I think that's a perfect place to, and I really just appreciate your time and sharing your, and looking forward to our next steps together. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Brian, and thanks for all the work you and your organization are doing to get these issues out in front of more people, because that is super important.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.